everyone. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. So, if you're watching on YouTube, if you could please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, or if you're listening on Spotify, you can always follow us there. Every like and share and subscribe can help our channel to be seen by many more Stargate fans. So, we really appreciate it. And then we also have all of our socials listed up on the screen right now if you wish to follow us there. Okay, thank you, and I hope you enjoy. Bye. And to all the Stargate fans out there, we would love to hear from you and chat with you on our show. So if you're interested in doing that, please reach out to us via any of our social media platforms or email.
So today we have a very special episode. And once again, we have our invited guest, Martin Ritter, because we just did something really cool and really exciting. And we're very excited to soon show the results of this. Is that for those of you that don't know, all of us are composers and various different, I'll let all of us each talk a little bit about our own composing trajectories, but we're all kind of in similar but different situations. And we all are, of course, Stargate fans. And it came upon us to have this idea, why don't we write music inspired by Stargate in some way or connected with Stargate in some way? For anyone that's looked at my list of works, they can see that that's already the case. I have so many pieces that are already having Stargate inspired titles. But this was something formal that we chose to do, and we created a sort of a recording session, and we called that with three of our pieces called Ascended Sound. And we hope to eventually expand this project, record more pieces, perform it live, and basically just connect to communities of people that are both musicians and also into Stargate. And so hopefully you will find with the result that we'll share on this channel, you'll find something very special and maybe something that you're interested in joining or participating in or just enjoying. We did this recording session, and we're going to share a little bit today about the whole concept in general and how it came to be, and also a little bit about our pieces and our experience with the recording session, and just to get you a little bit hyped about this, and also a little bit about music and media and its importance. And also, I think we're all big fans of the Stargate soundtrack, so we'll touch on that a little bit. But I think I would maybe like to start with just talking a little bit about the pieces that we each wrote. So there's a couple components of this recording session. We each wrote a piece approximately 7 minutes in length for 6 instruments, flute, clarinet, 2 violins, cello, and piano. And they were recorded recently. And they were recorded by musicians from Graz, from the Kunstuniversität Graz. And we will also share all the information about the musicians as well soon in this episode. But first, let's start with everybody maybe sharing a little bit about the piece, why they wrote it, and how it's connected with Stargate. And so I will maybe ask Emily to start.
I knew it. No, that's fine. Okay, so what we all decided to choose kind of like an episode, right? I mean, I won't speak for you guys, I'll just speak for myself.
Yeah, and maybe maybe before also just give a little bit about your composition background and what you do, because I think we all do a little bit, we have a little bit slightly different composition backgrounds, and so I think for people to know where we're coming from, we kind of
so I tend to compose for film. So yeah, I'm a film composer. I don't really know what else to say about that, but yeah, I'm a film composer. So I guess my score maybe reflects that. I don't know. And yeah, so anyways, I chose one of my absolute favorite episodes from Stargate Atlantis to have my piece be inspired by, which is Grace Under Pressure. And basically what I did with that was I had rewatched the episode to kind of make like key points of what I felt like the emotions kind of were through things. So because I tend to compose for film a lot of times, I am composing for like a scene and the emotional aspect of what's happening in that scene and a vibe for that scene. So that's kind of the approach I took with this. Was I one thing that I love about this episode is kind of the mental aspect that McKay goes throughout the whole episode, and how it's like he's amazing, like the actor's amazing with how he can carry that whole episode almost on his own. It's almost just him, and what he goes through while he's trapped in the ocean, basically in the ship, and basically the anxieties he goes through, and then the weird delirious almost kind of like funny aspects that he goes through, and then he hallucinates Carter. And so initially what I did is I just kind of rewatched that episode and just kind of wrote down things that stood out to me of how he was feeling. So like overall vibes of emotion. And so basically with my piece, I kind of wanted to start it off with kind of the moment where the ship is falling into the ocean. And so I kind of attempted to kind of have it sound like almost like a falling kind of anxious kind of feel. And then throughout, I just kind of visualized moments of that episode. So like I had like it's a shame I never thought to have my notes that I had at one point, but like initially I can't remember fully like what I had done now, but I know like initially there was certain instruments that like I was having portray McKay's like emotions throughout, and then there was like sometimes when I can't remember if I fully did this now, but I'll mention it anyways. But when he hallucinates Carter, like having that kind of almost be like a distraction or another like sound and thought that kind of comes in, and kind of like a call and response kind of thing with that. And so anyways, so yeah, so throughout the piece I kind of have it be like a mix of how I would perceive it to be like anxiety and kind of panic, and then switching it to at times like almost like a calmer feel, because there was times in that episode where he wasn't all with it, that he was like the moment became quieter, if that makes sense. He kind of like, even though he didn't know like how he was going to get out of that situation, like he became a little bit delirious and out of it, which then I felt kind of changed the mood and the vibe a little to kind of be a little oddly more peaceful, even though it wasn't a peaceful thing. And then like when he's like hallucinating Carter, that kind of thing. So basically my whole piece was based off of emotion is the grand scheme of things. And how I perceived that to happen in what happened in the episode. And then by the end of it, at the very end, I kind of attempted it to kind of be the moment where Shepard then finds the ship, and it's like that sense of like relief at the last second that he has been found and will be helped. So that is it.
So I have a one, I mean, this is really interesting. And of course, it's also an episode I really, really love. And you can definitely hear this sort of push and pull in a piece, I think, quite well. One thing I think would be interesting to ask you as someone that is normally, because you described that the process initially you took was kind of similar in terms of how you're writing the music to fit the emotion. But one thing that's a little bit different, I guess, in this compared to when you're writing for film would be the time aspect, right? And so I wanted to ask what your experience was then writing this, where you're kind of writing it for like an episode and kind of a way, but without the sort of time structure of fitting it to the timing in the episode.
Yeah.
And did it make you feel like more freedom, or did it have a little bit more restriction or some other feeling because you didn't have the structure of the episode?
I think it makes me feel like I can make it sound more like a completed song, if that makes sense, because a lot
Gotcha.
of times in film it's like you do little cues, little sections of music that are for that moment, but on its own it might just be feeling like part of a song. It's not always like a completed feeling of a thing. So like but also I feel like even before I initially was interested or knew I wanted to do film music, I always did kind of compose in that way where I always created a story in my mind. And so in my mind, I'm like seeing like flashes of like scenes that I make up. Um, and then I compose the music to go along with that. So I kind of feel like I'm always like kind of stuck in this like forever like film in my mind, regardless of if it's actually for a film or not. So it just kind of feels natural, I guess. So it's different in the sense that it usually then feels like, you know, it has the sections of the song where, you know, there's kind of like, you know, a structure, more of a structure to it, I guess, sometimes. In terms of it feeling like it reaches like a completion of the song at the end, whereas in film it sometimes just kind of works for that scene, and it never fully completes, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
No, that actually answered that really well. And so I think maybe now might be a good time to play a little excerpt. So maybe I'll go second.
Okay.
And the reason being is because I thought it was really interesting when we were in the recording session, Martin mentioned that it was kind of a nice arc, because if we start with your piece, it's like we have this sort of entry with film music. And I think my piece is of course contemporary. Like I'll say in a minute, I'm a contemporary composer and I'm working in a little bit different. But Martin's is the one using the most contemporary and extended techniques. That's the most out there. So it's kind of like this arc where I kind of bridge between the two of you, which is kind of really interesting. And I think that makes it very effective. So just I am also a composer. But I work primarily with concert music, art music. I have a background in computer music, so I actually started as a computer musician, working with like controllers and things like that to create concert performances. And now I also do acoustic music as well. My piece was kind of inspired a little bit by two episodes, and really kind of a concept that is really the same but very different in both episodes. And those two episodes they're in the title. It's called Unending Window of Opportunity. And there's two episodes in Stargate SG1. One is Window of Opportunity from season 4. And anyone watching this that has an interest in Stargate probably knows immediately what I mean when I say that. But for anyone that doesn't, it's an episode where O'Neill and Teal'c are caught in this sort of time loop, and they repeat the same day over and over and over again until they can solve it. And Unending is the last episode of SG1, the last ever serial episode, where the crew is on the ship and they get the Asgard core, but when it's active, they're tracked by the Ori, and they have to basically pause time. And so you see that there's this kind of similarity in both episodes where they're unable to go forward in time. There's this kind of either freezing of time or repeating of time. And I think when we hear my piece, it'll be quite clear that I brought this forward, because the whole concept of the piece is that there's this underlying repetitive structure, but around it there's these micro changes and micro fluctuations. So for example, for anyone listening, just on the piano part, it starts very sort of rigid, but it kind of falls apart and then falls back together, and it loops like this. But around this looping, all the other instruments are transforming, and the transformation is somewhat disconnected from the loop. So it's kind of a little bit like the time aspect is a little bit in flux and with all these different sort of cycles that don't necessarily line up, but have this sort of either repetitive or frozen nature. And because I was working with this, I also don't have like a strong trajectory in the piece. It's more like opening a window of time that is continuous and then closing it at the end. So if you listen to the end and you can imagine the very last moment, it could be the end, but it could also be continuing the piece. So that's kind of where I was going with mine.
That is really cool. And I wanted to mention too, like I haven't fully heard your piece yet because of how we
Yes.
had to like record it and I wasn't there when you were recording it. So like I've only heard a small clip which sounds really awesome. And so like I'm excited now hearing how you describe it to then hear the full thing because that'll be really cool. But like what I was curious is like did you have like you know how like I was saying like how sometimes like when I compose things I tend to like see things in images and things like that. Like do you have like a certain process that you have or even just particular like to this piece that you compose that is kind like how did you initially approach it?
In this piece particularly, it was 100% with timing. And so I thought the best way to kind of get this aspect across was to work with the timing. And so how did it start? I really took the duration and I divided into three because each sort of if you when you listen to the piece, so here there's these piano chords and they're all 3 seconds. And then I calculated shifts between the each sort of it was basically interpolating between blocked piano chords and arpeggiated piano chords with specified time intervals. And so it was all kind of, I guess, in a way, like it's kind of funny because it's very math, like it's just math. I mostly use math. If I like look at the base level, how did I compose this? I used math.
That's really cool though.
Uh,
That's really cool.
which is really funny because I mean, in the end, this has this like really delicate and sound, but it's a very math.
That's interesting. Huh. That's cool.
Yeah. And so maybe now it's a good time to play a short excerpt. And then now I will move on to Martin. And I will ask him some questions about his piece because you had the third piece. And can you tell us a little bit about that piece and your process and also the title?
And his background too, like
Yes, yes. Tell us
Okay.
also a bit about your background. So,
Well, I'm just like Alyssa, I would consider myself a contemporary music composer, whatever that means today. So I'm coming from more the academic side of things. So definitely not uh, a media composer or movie composer or anything like that. Um, my piece is called The Ninth Chevron. So I think if I remember right, we hadn't started watching Universe yet when I wrote that piece. I, of course, knew about Universe, but uh, so hadn't really seen it since it originally aired. I watched the first season, I think, back then, but so I didn't remember anything. But anyway, for me in this piece, I think I don't know why. I think because we were talking about watching Universe and moving into that. So I was for some reason deciding to do something along those lines, I guess. And for me, at least for this piece, I was just, thinking about the concept of the series, being sort of stranded on the ship in somewhere in the universe and just keep going without knowing where you are or where you're going to end up. So that was sort of my starting point. And yeah, I don't know. Generally, what I'm interested in is sort of texture and timbre in my music. So what you're going to hear a lot is the strings, for example, putting the bow in places to affect what the string sounds like, moving the bow up and down the string as well to get different timbres. Yeah, I don't know.
So like a lot of extended techniques then?
It depends on your definition of a lot. For contemporary music, I would say no. For anybody not familiar with contemporary music, probably yes. But like for me, it is all about the timbre and subtle shifts. Like I think we'll see once we hear the full recordings if I was successful. But sort of the idea was that everything is subtly shifting all the time, so you can never really settle into anything. Like I think tonally, in terms of the harmony of the piece, it's very straightforward. There's those big piano chords coming in, and they're very traditional, just big stacked chords, moving up and down more or less a whole tone scale, which is traditionally used to kind of depict vastness and something that is not ending, because there is no real tonal center. You cannot rest on anything. But everything around that is always shifting. Nothing is ever stable in the sense that even if the strings are playing a sustained long note, the note itself, the timbre of it is always moving, always doing something. So yeah, I don't know. That makes
That
sense.
is really cool. That is really cool. I find like listening to how you guys describe how you do your music really fascinating because it's so like different, from my world of film that it's always really cool to hear, like how you approach it and stuff. So, so would you say that, so you mentioned universe. So would you say then your piece is kind of, even though you hadn't started rewatching Universe, then kind of based off of the vibe of the season or so of Universe, or is there anything specific
Well,
that you were kind of
not again, the only thing at that point I remembered about Universe is literally the hook of the show, that they end up on this ancient ship that is lost and falling apart, and they don't know if how, what, where, when, and why. And that's all I knew. And I kind of just like the idea of just this drifting aimlessly for them, but there is a clear, I mean, there's a goal. The ship has its own sort of goal, right? The ship is its own character. But they're just along for the ride and there's no real input of what's about to happen. So I kind of like that idea of there's this vastness, this unknown. It's always changing, but there's a trajectory, but we have no influence on the trajectory. So throughout the piece, I think 2 or 3 times there's this piano, those piano chords are coming in that are really kind of brutal and in comparison to the rest of the texture, right? Whereas the other instruments, the violins and the woodwinds, they're sort of, for the most part, really delicate and long notes and just all those timbral shifts. But then the piano is this brutal element almost, interrupting that. however you want to interpret that. The piano is also the one instrument where you play the note and it plays however it plays, right? Like I can affect the note after it is played, but it's difficult on the piano. I'm not using any extended techniques on the piano. It's literally just those chords, which is half true. Now that I think about it, there's one section where I do dampen the string on the piano to get some timbre. But the overall idea is those big chords that come in, that is unchanging, kind of taking over the texture, and everything else around is shifting. And
That's cool.
then there's this one weird section, and yeah, anyway.
Like,
I have one question for you.
Yes,
And I
of
really
course.
apologize. It's maybe a mean question.
No.
You just mentioned, you had the statement, you talk about a Stargate universe and the ship being the main character, right? But it's not like
Yes.
so, but yet there's all these little aspects that kind of play a role, but really the ship is the main character. So if you were to take your piece and you're describing all these different aspects of it, is there something that is, quote unquote, the ship in your piece, like the sort of hidden main character?
To me,
Yeah.
and again, I'm curious if I feel the same way once I hear it recorded as a full entity, right? Because I heard it in a recording session, but your brain is in a million different places, right? But to me, when I wrote it, when I think about the score and how it is put together, to me it is those piano chords, those the big open chords over like 3 octaves or something, that move slowly and loudly, unstopping, right?
Okay.
Everything else around is kind of subservient to that at that point. There's nothing else. That is the thing that is in the foreground. Yeah. So yes, the piano in those chords.
So you would say those piano chords. Okay.
Yes.
what's interesting is because, like, again, I haven't fully heard your piece. I've only heard a little clip, which was really cool. It's like intense. I really liked it. It is that as you're describing it to me, like, because like you have like the image of from Stargate universe behind you. It's like I kind
I
of
forgot.
That's
Yes.
true.
I kind of like think of like before you mentioned the piano being like the ship, I was kind of like feeling like how you're describing it. I was imagining like it kind of being like the piano's kind of like the danger aspect of what they're going through, and then that the colors that are behind you, like it's kind of like the strings.
Yeah.
Like the lightness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny though that you're in a background that is kind of depicting your piece in a way.
I guess. I mean, you're also going to hear, at least in one of the sections, the piano has the big chords, but then sort of the strings, they mimic the chord, but is offset, and they have this big envelope of coming in from nothing into the chord and going back out. So there's the piano and then the strings zoom, zoom, coming in and out, sort of kind of trying to, I don't know, make conform to it, but it never quite works out, and so
Yeah, I think it could. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it could be really interesting for us to also share screenshots of parts of the scores, because I think it'd be interesting for people to see the differences of like when you're scoring, like what you were just mentioning, compared to like
anyway, yeah, I can
scoring and stuff.
send you that page where that happens, and you can superimpose it when we talk about it.
Yeah, now I guess it would be a good time to also play an excerpt from Martin's piece. So now you've heard a little bit about all these pieces and a little bit of the music. And yeah, very soon we will have these videos up on the channel so that you can watch them. And we think that this could be a really interesting project to keep going and maybe be performed live at Stargate related functions, at non-Stargate related functions, and to also build a network of people that are musicians interested in performing, and also composers that are interested in writing. So one thing I wanted to share with the two of you, because I actually talked with all the musicians at the recording session. And so for everybody watching, I would really suggest, if you haven't already, definitely follow our Instagram, because we're not only going to be sharing some snippets, but we're also going to be sharing some more information about the musicians so that you can also follow them and learn more about them, and maybe grow a network of people that you're interested in and also that might be interested in Stargate. But I did talk to the musicians because I thought it would be interesting, since I did tell everyone about the project when I asked them to perform. I told them kind of what it was. Well, some people like joined earlier, and so they had kind of maybe a different idea, because originally we were going to do this live, but it's very complicated with funding in the country I live at the moment, and so some things were a little bit delayed, and so the live portion will be delayed. But all the musicians were aware that it was a Stargate related project. At least that was in the message that I had sent to all of them. I had asked them, hey, I have this project called Ascended Sounds. We're writing pieces based on the TV show Stargate. Would you be interested in participating? And obviously everybody that joined said yes. But what I think is really fascinating when I talk to them is that I asked them where they're from, what they're studying, and what instrument they play, and a couple other questions, but I asked them also if they're science fiction fans and if they'd ever heard of Stargate. And of all 6 musicians, there were a couple that kind of said, not yes and not no to being sci-fi fans. There was one that said emphatically no. She was like, no, I do not like sci-fi. And there was one person that was very emphatically yes. So they're kind of into sci-fi and other kind, like video games, this kind of thing. So one emphatic yes, one emphatic no, and then the rest somewhere in the middle between kind of like a yeah, sure, and a not really. Only one knew what Stargate was. So a lot of people hadn't heard of it, or maybe, and I think maybe one other said, yeah, maybe, like, but not like for sure. And so I think I found that very fascinating, because while a lot of them, not necessarily were science fiction fans or necessarily into fandom, it does show that Stargate should be more known, I think. And I feel like that's something, it's a very underrated science fiction show that, I mean, and of course, I'm maybe biased because I'm on this podcast, but I think it's one of the best, if not the best, science fiction shows. And so I am curious if either of you are surprised about that demographic information about the musicians, knowing that they were well aware of what the project was going into it.
Well,
Oh,
sorry.
you
Go
no,
ahead.
you go ahead, Martin. You go ahead.
Okay. I am a little surprised over the proportion of just sci-fi enthusiasm, let's say, in the group, because certainly being, especially when I was in undergrad and early grad school, certainly there were quite a few people who were into sci-fi, not Stargate specifically, but just sci-fi in general. And I would definitely say that, or maybe I just gravitated towards people that were, I don't know, but that there was certainly quite a few people who I would say were part of the fandom in one way or another. So I'm a little bit surprised by that. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised about the Stargate proportion of of people even knowing about it, never mind being part of the fandom. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say I'm not actually surprised, but the reason I'm not surprised is because I got a vibe when we were doing the rehearsal, and you mentioned through part of it to them about it being for like based off of inspired by Stargate. And I felt like a lot of them had very blank looks on their face when you said that.
Okay. And they're like, what is Stargate?
And so I was just like, oh, okay. Like initially going into it because you had communicated the project to everyone. And initially the project was initially quite different in the sense that we planned on having it be a venue and stuff that was specifically had to do with Stargate. That I assumed that everyone was like massive Stargate nerds and was just like, oh yeah, like cool. Because I felt like some of them seemed very enthused about it, with their feedback of wanting to do the project. And so I just initially assumed that. But then when, things progressed and then we go fast forward to like the rehearsal and recording and you mentioned it, like I was just like, oh yeah, I don't think any of them know what Stargate is. um but I totally agree with what you're saying, that it does kind of make it glaringly obvious that more people need to know about Stargate. Because I think sometimes I go back and forth where I either assume people just know what Stargate is because I love Stargate so much, and there is a good size of fans out there, right? There's tons of groups and everything where, like on Facebook and whatever, that people join that are really enthusiastic about Stargate. So I think when involved in that type of community, you start to assume, or at least I start to assume, that more people know about it than they do. Um, and so usually whenever I have talked about Stargate to people, I usually get either a very blank look of like they clearly have no idea what show I'm talking about. They're just like, oh, okay, cool. Like, or they're the opposite where they're really enthused. They're like, yeah, I love Stargate. I feel like it's like one
Yeah.
or the other. They either don't know what it is or they love it. And I feel like the difference with that and say like Star Trek, Star Wars, I feel like everyone knows Star Trek and Star Wars, whether they like sci-fi, whether they're into it or not. Whereas with Stargate, it's usually you're into it and you know about it, like, or you just don't, usually if
True.
you're, it's like, yeah. So yeah, sorry, I keep babbling.
No, I think that's very interesting. Yeah. And I have noticed that too, because there's lots of people that they've heard of Star Trek and it's like, yeah, it's okay, or they don't really like it. But yeah, I thought it was interesting because I also think it goes volumes to show how enthusiastic they are about just doing things that and being open to things that are kind of outside of their normal operating realm. And also just to add for people that are watching, all of the performers, they were coming from a contemporary performance practice, so primarily working with contemporary music, and so it is actually even more expanding to work with film music. And I did also tell them, it is contemporary composers and film composer, so they were aware of that and still said, yeah, sure. So I think that kind of speaks volumes about their enthusiasm and what they were willing to do.
Yeah, they were great. That was cool.
Yeah. And so I think it was a very valuable experience. And I mean, maybe right now would be kind of a good time to share how, like, maybe our own personal reflections on what we thought of the project and maybe how we felt going in versus how we feel after hearing the rehearsal. And I know, I apologize, Emily's in this unique situation where she was not in the same physical location as the rehearsal, so she only got to hear her piece over the phone. But you can maybe say as best you can. But maybe in this case, I'll start with Martin, since last
Yeah.
time I started with Emily, and now it's time for you to say your thoughts about this whole experience.
That's a big topic. My thoughts. Um,
I guess my question is like kind of how did it end up meeting or exceeding or being outside of your expectations versus what you thought going in and your experience with kind of doing the project and realizing it?
Well, that's a tough question, I have to say.
I'm sorry.
If you
Because,
need time
no,
to
that's
think
okay.
about it, I can
No,
always
no,
go.
no, it's okay. I'll just make
Okay.
something up. That's how this goes. No, no. Well, it's interesting. I mean, again, I come from this, for lack of a better description, and I don't necessarily like this description, but I come from this contemporary music, academic music background, right? So I never studied film music. I have no professional experience with film music. I wouldn't know how to approach a piece in that context. I wouldn't know how to orchestrate or write in that kind of medium for that purpose. It's a very different purpose writing for film or for media than it is what I do, right? So in that light, it was sort of a very the initial idea of the project was kind of scary in the sense that it was based on this medium and how do I approach this medium, um, where there is already music attached to that is very recognizable, that is very thematically driven, um, where you have, let's see, what, 15 years worth of music or something, right? Spanning from multiple shows, multiple composers, movies. There's even games. I don't know the games, so I don't know the music of those. But so in that sense, it was sort of an interesting and nerve-wracking initial. What am I going to bring to this? How am I going to approach this? And not necessarily do it justice, but do justice in my own way, like for my music, to not get covered up by, 15 years of other people's creative output, but at the same time, me not sort of invalidating, for lack of a better word, what they have been doing, right? So, how it all turned out, well, we'll have to wait and see. I don't know. I'm happy with the piece I wrote. I'm very happy with the performance of it, and now I'm just curious to hear it finally, mixed, mastered, and put together, and see how it feels then. After the rehearsal and recording, I'm cautiously optimistic that it will be okay.
Yes, it'll be better than okay. It'll be awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered anything, but
Yeah, no,
That
it was
totally did.
okay.
totally. Yeah, and it's really interesting to hear your experience, which I'm sure is like completely contrasting from Emily's coming from the
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's kind of like if you take it as two extremes, you're coming from
Mhm.
outside and doing a piece inspired by like the media. And
Mhm.
Emily's coming from working with the media, but then to writing a piece inspired by it. So it's kind of like an
Mhm.
interesting bridge towards maybe something that's a little bit more unified than, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah. So I don't know what your experience was like, Emily.
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think so going into it, I was just like initially just really excited. Like I was just like, oh my God, this is gonna be so freaking awesome. I think initially I didn't think about like, oh, comparing it to like the soundtrack of Stargate, because in my mind that it was separate from that in terms of like, when we were talking about like our ideas of what we were gonna be doing and stuff, I kind of saw it as like a separate thing in terms of, we weren't trying to make it sound like a Stargate soundtrack as opposed to just what we as composers are inspired by with the show, right? That's how I took it. But later on, I do have to say I started thinking about that. I'm like, oh, like I really hope like people aren't comparing my music to the Stargate soundtrack because it's not going to meet that. But I think for me too, it's kind of like, I think going into it was mainly just like an excitement and just like thinking, okay, like what am I gonna, be inspired by? Like there's so many things in the show that I love. Like what am I choosing? And then once I chose like what to focus on, then kind of going into when we were getting closer to the recording, I think like for me as a film composer that has so far worked in very low budget films that tend to never have a budget to actually work with live musicians, I was super excited to like actually have my stuff like played by actual musicians because I don't get that often. And just with my even like my background of the different universities I went to, they never had a good budget at those universities to actually allow the composers there to work with musicians often. So I sadly haven't had the chance to work with musicians often and have my stuff recorded. So I was like super excited about that because that's always like a struggle in film, to ever get that. It has to be a much higher budget to be able to do that. So that was part of it. Like I think I was very nervous about it, because I think it can be nerve-wracking for composers and musicians working together because it's like the composer has a very like, at least from my perspective, the composer usually has a very set view of kind of what they're anticipating their music to be and to sound like, and you try your best to make it clear in the music that you notate and compose, but also giving that freedom to the musician to kind of translate that too, like. And so then I think for me, I was going into it kind of nervous in the sense of being worried, is it going to sound like how I'm anticipating, or is it, and I don't mean this by disrespect to the musicians because they're amazing. I was like nervous about it getting butchered just because of my own anxiety, not because of their ability by any means. It was just my own anxiety with it. So I was going into it kind of nervous with that, not knowing what to fully expect. And like just hoping that I had composed it in a way that made it clear what I was hoping for. And then going into them rehearsing it, it's funny because like the pictures that you sent of like the little image of your phone and then you see my face and like oh god, I look like terrified. I'm like look like shell shocked and my face is like all red because like I'm so like anxious. I have like these like two red circles on my cheeks and I'm just like
I thought you were like concentrating. It looked like you were
I mean, I was concentrating,
like,
but
okay.
it was also anxiety. And so it was just really funny. But I think once I was actually like there, there on the phone, I think like I felt more calm. It was just kind of like the anxiety. I get like this with things just in general, like the anxiety before something, I get very like worked up. And then once I'm there, I'm like, okay, cool, I'm good. And I think all the musicians were quite chill. The environment felt very good. Like it felt very like chill. That's the only way I know how to put it.
Yeah.
And so
it was good vibes.
Yeah, good vibes. So it didn't feel anxiety ridden. And I felt like everyone worked well together. And I think then that helped me calm down. And then when the musicians were actually playing it and it actually was like sounding how I envisioned, and the things that I was worried about that like I thought I would maybe have to explain, I didn't have to. And so it worked out really nicely. So overall, I think it was like an awesome experience, and I'm excited to hear the recording, because like all I was able to hear was like through WhatsApp. It's just like a little bit of that. So, and I'm really excited to hear your guys' pieces. So I think overall, good experience.
Yeah. Oh, that's
And
it's really
you,
interesting. I mean, I have to say, one, it's a little bit unfair for me to talk about like I would say between all three of us, I probably have the closest already existing experience to doing this kind of thing, because as I've said, I wrote a lot of pieces which were kind of inspired in a way by various things in Stargate. So I would say I already have quite a lot of pieces that are like in terms of the actual writing of it. In terms of the like, it's interesting hearing you describe the feelings beforehand, because I have to say also the role I had and also the role Martin had to some extent is a little bit different, because I was working on an organization. And so I actually was completely not nervous at all, because I was dealing with stuff. And so as a like generally like in any kind of situation we're organizing, we do concert organizing, we do a lot of projects here as well that are like normal contemporary concerts in museums. But in this case, often what happens is there's little things that will arise that even when you prepare and anticipate, they come up and you kind of have to solve them. So like, for example, one of the issues we're setting up, and in the camera there's chairs, and so we have to move all the chairs out and of the room.
Only 100 of them.
Yeah, 100 chairs. It was like a ton of chairs. Okay. And so I think in that sense, you don't really have a moment to be nervous, because you have to focus on the, you know, getting the thing running. And then there was a musician who had asked me for a tablet, and I brought one. But I don't know how to use any kind of notation software. So I figured, well, I get the PDFs on, and as soon as it's there, some musician will help me. And somebody did, but I had to download the software. And then the person was not so accustomed with the software, which is like super understandable. And so then we ended up having to figure out a link another player. So there's these little things that kind of come up that are sort of unanticipated, and that's kind of it changes the experience, so that any kind of like where probably your experience is, you were probably sitting there waiting for your rehearsal, where you have this ability to be like anxious, which is maybe not. I have this luxury of like having to like do stuff, and then I don't think about it at all, because in my at that moment, like my main role is the organizer, and the like person running being in the rehearsal, it's kind of like the secondary until like the moment my rehearsal comes, because the other thing is to make sure that everybody stays in a proper time. In this case, like there were some people that needed to catch trains, and so it was very important that we kind of maintained a time flow. And so those are other things that kind of come into play in the situations. And this is a unique situation in that it's not a concert, it's recording. So it's very easy, I think, to get caught up in spending too much time on something without realizing, because it's not a, you know, go one thing to the next. And so, but I would say overall, like in terms of how everything went, the vibe was very amazing. And I was very, very impressed with how professional everyone was, and how, like when you think it's an amazing job to interpret 3 such different pieces in such a short time and under those circumstances, I think exceeded every expectation. So
that's awesome. It's interesting to me that you never once mentioned anything about your composition during that whole explanation of how you felt. So that's really fascinating to me, but it makes sense, because like you said, you're organizing everything, so that was your main focus. Like, did you ever feel any kind of nerves when it came time that they were about to play your piece, or you're just kind of so used to that you didn't really think about it?
Nope, not at all. But also, to be fair, like I had this thing, you know, they were working on the dealing with tempos and stuff in yours, and it's really unfair, because this is like a complete feature of mine, that the piano can literally be the conductor, because they have the steady beat, so it's super easy for everybody to orient. So as soon as like I realized, oh, this is actually going to be really easy, they can keep the time with this, I thought, well, it's going to be fine. But it's also like I should also mention that this is where it's a little bit a different situation between, like, say your end and our end, is that I'm familiar with all these musicians. And so like you kind of had to trust us which I think is very hard, and knowing, and also, I mean, I knew where the musicians were coming from. I did not know all of them personally until the day. There was only one I had met like in person, and some I communicated with over text or watched them perform, but there was one that I had worked with before. but otherwise it was also a little bit new to me. But I'm quite aware in this program the level of sort of professionalism that the musicians have. So it was easier for me, I think, to be relaxed. And I've definitely been in situations like where, because you mentioned being a little bit anxious about it being performed, and I have definitely been in situations where I've had pieces where it was completely like there was no preparation, and it was definitely not the piece that was performed. um it's just, it was in different locations, and um often in places where they don't have a lot of contemporary music. So usually people are used to playing a certain thing, or they have a certain expectation, and then because of that, or if contemporary music isn't like what they're primarily doing, they don't put so much of a focus and figure they don't have to perform it like perform it as to that level. So I
Yeah.
think I think that's probably the difference, and I completely understand that, because there's definitely places or like locations or situations where the players don't really have such the concept of interpreting new music or newer music, and so it's a very, and I think that's very valid to mention. So
Yeah. And I think too, like for me as well, like I've just kind of been, like in unfortunate circumstances where I think a lot of times, like when people are like getting their degree and stuff at like, a bachelor's or a master's degree and it's involving composition, normally I mean, I think when you went to the U of O, you worked with musicians all the time, right? Like, um, but like I went to a university that ended up getting closed down because after I graduated, because they didn't have any money anymore. And so really like during my whole bachelor's degree, I only had like two times that I had a piece performed by actual musicians. And then when I went and worked on my master's here, like we only worked with musicians once and it wasn't even with a piece I composed. So, and then there's been a few times that I've gotten my piece played, but again, like there have been situations where musicians that I know like had been like practicing and stuff like butchered my piece and it was fairly simple music. And so I think that's where my anxiety came from, is that like I don't um have like a bunch of experience working with musicians, and then the limited experience that I do have it sometimes didn't always turn out. And so I think the more I tend to get the opportunities to work with musicians that it actually works out nicely, like then I'll probably be less like that, I think, in the future with things. But it's just unfortunate because in the film community it's like low budgets, you're not never gonna get the chance to really have it be an instrument unless you're playing it yourself, and they have a bigger budget. So
yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, are these experiences. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because, listening to this coming from the contemporary music side, especially here, the musicians that are trained here, have their careers here, they definitely have this sort of ingrained attitude, I would say, to really, really, really want to do what the composer tells them to do, to a fault,
oh,
almost,
interesting.
right? And that is because traditionally contemporary music composers are super picky about everything. Like that technique needs to be exactly like this, and it can only be this long, and it needs to be this loud at this location, and like super fine-grained detail of everything. And everything has to be perfect, and everything has to be done just that way, right? Um, at least, in the past, like I would say, in the 90s and early 2000s, 2010s, that was definitely sort of the way that new music would, or new music composers, I should say, would operate with their music. And so, of course, the musicians that were in school during that time would be sort of imbued with that attitude, right?
Hmm.
So I find it interesting always, rehearsing here, because me personally, that is not how I operate with my music, and how I think about my music, how I think my music should be played. Because once I've written it, unless there's something in the score where I made a mistake and it's just not doable, which happens, where I think it goes a certain way, but just physically it doesn't work.
Mhm.
Okay, tell me, I will fix it. It's just not feasible, or it's too difficult when there's an easier way of getting the same sort of result, that is different. But I am of the opinion for myself, once I've written the score and handed it over to you, I don't care anymore what I have to say about the score. I want to know what you get out of the score, despite me, almost, right? I want to know, the thing that I put on the score that you interpret, is that close to what I thought I put there? That is to me the joy of composing, right?
Mhm.
Um, and there have been situations where the piece turned out totally different than I thought it would, much better than I thought it would, actually. So the piece worked despite of my inaptitudes of, you know. So to me, that is the interesting part, when I don't have to do anything as a composer other than fix my own mistakes. I
I think
don't
that,
I don't want to be involved on that level as a composer, telling them, oh well, here you were a little bit too slow, here were a little bit too that. That is not the interesting part,
yeah,
you
that's
know.
really interesting for me to hear because I feel like that must feel really nice to be able to like almost have that freedom, like mentally, like to be able to have like the freedom to just kind of give it up to the people playing it because I feel like
Oh, I'm still nervous as hell. Don't worry.
yeah, but I
It,
mean,
it,
I feel like I always remember like back when I was like just like working on my bachelor's degree. I remember my composition teacher saying like, it's good to, like put like the dynamics and different things down, like so they know what you want them to play, but not to like overdo it so that you're trying to control like every little thing. Um, and so I feel like with myself, it's like it's sometimes like I'm like as I'm composing it, I'm sometimes trying to think like, okay, like I don't want to like be too controlling with it, but I have a very kind of like controlling like attitude at times. So like it's like trying to find like a balance to allow there to be like an interpretation of it, but then at the same time still getting like how you envision it,
yeah. I
So
mean, I, I mean, this might be a good opportunity to put up as a page of your score versus a page of my score side by
mhm.
side,
Yeah.
because my score is packed with information.
Yeah.
It's just packed,
Yeah.
right? But at the end of the day, I I don't know how I'm supposed to say this, but you know, I of course have a vision of what I want it to sound like, right? And if they do something completely different, I will of course speak up and say something, right? But how they exactly interpret it, if they go, really molto sol ponticello versus son ponticello, for example, which, other composers will really care about. If they, take an extra 2 seconds on that fermata, or they slow down 2 measures earlier because it feels better to them, how it falls under the hand or whatever. Those kind of things I couldn't care less, because that will make the piece better. Because if the
Mhm.
musicians feel like it flows better and it feels better the way they interact with the piece on a physical level, I feel like that brings a dimension to the musicality in the end, that is better, that will be better no matter what it is on the score,
Mhm.
right? So but that doesn't mean I don't put everything and anything I think is important into the score. So
Yeah, and I
so
think too,
like I don't want to overdo it necessarily, but I am more on the overdoing side than the underdoing, I have to say, and that's something I struggle with at times, to find a good balance there, like
mhm.
just in terms of my own inner workings of when I compose.
Yeah.
What needs to be there, what doesn't need to be there, because I have too many instructions at times, because as I said, I'm interested in this always shifting of timbre and always shifting of texture and all this stuff, right? And that is quite a bit of information where there is no standardized way of notating that.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of text, there's lots of arrows, and there's lots of little squiggly things in my score and this and that, right? So
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because as being someone that is not familiar with like contemporary scores, like probably if I look at it, I'd probably think it's very particular of everything you're supposed to do. So it's interesting to hear that it's actually kind of, in a sense, the opposite of it. Like you're particular, but there's that freedom. So that's really interesting, I think. So it will be interesting to see your score, and for people to see it, I think, because I think there's probably, you know, maybe many people watching this that maybe aren't, as familiar with music, as well, since this is a Stargate, podcast. And so it might be interesting for people to see kind of like the different elements of music and how people can compose things and stuff. So
Yeah,
cool.
totally. Yeah.
And I think it would be really awesome too, like if people had any questions, like for any of us, or just, whether it's about the music in particular or whatever, but also just like people also letting us know their interests, like if they're composers or if they're musicians, that would be interested, say we, plan something where we can like be at a con in the US or something, like, or wherever, like see, for people
if you
to
want to
basically
reperform
reach
those
out to us.
pieces.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
re-perform.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Like it would be awesome to see, if people are interested in joining us on this.
Yeah, and would you be interested in like regular Stargate themed concerts and such? I think that would be, yeah, I think this was a really successful project. I think when you listen to it, you'll find that there are, although the pieces are very different, there's some similarities between them. So when we do share those pieces, it'd be interesting to hear from you, your thoughts. And if you're kind of new to contemporary music, we'd also like to kind of hear your thoughts on some of the contemporary pieces, because a lot of people that have never, like aren't necessarily interested listening to contemporary music. But I think that in these pieces, there's something really nice. And so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on everything. So yeah.
Yeah.